Lewis Hamilton shocks the whole world by announcing his move to Red Bull. Do you want to know why he made this decision? Stay until the end and I'll tell you everything. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The announcement detonated like a bomb in the heart of Formula One, a decision so outrageous, so unexpected, that even those closest to the inner circles of the paddock struggled to process it. Lewis Hamilton, the man who had built an empire on defying odds, the man who carried 7 world championships as though they were scars of battle, had signed with Red Bull Racing. For years fans, pundits and rivals had spoken about his dream of ending his career as a Ferrari legend, wrapped in the same red that had immortalized Schumacher, Lauda, and Ascari. He had stood on stages in Maranello, his smile polished for the cameras, his speeches full of romantic promises about reviving Ferrari's golden era. Yet those speeches had been smoke, hiding the rot underneath, because behind the glossy press releases and ceremonial unveilings, there had been fractures, widening cracks that tore deeper into Hamilton's relationship with the Scuderia until nothing remained but disappointment, betrayal and disillusionment. The truth was simple yet brutal: Hamilton had never truly been Ferrari's chosen one. From the moment he walked through the gates of Maranello, he felt the air of skepticism, the whispers of engineers loyal to Charles Leclerc, the way meetings tilted ever so slightly in favor of the young Monegasque. The philosophy of the car was the first warning sign. Ferrari's technical team, under the quiet yet firm guidance of Frédéric Vasseur, built a machine that danced to Leclerc's rhythm. The SFXX leaned toward sharp, aggressive rotation, a twitchy beast that could pirouette into corners with lightning entry speed if handled with Charles's reflexive touch. But Hamilton's genius was not in chaos. It was in taming stability, in extracting consistency from balance, in stretching tires and machinery beyond their supposed limits. The very DNA of the Ferrari contradicted the instincts that had made him invincible. The frustration grew like rust, invisible at first but corrosive over time. On Fridays, behind closed garage doors, Hamilton's radio messages carried the weight of suppressed anger. At Imola, after a practice run where the rear end bucked against him with violent unpredictability, his voice was sharp and raw: "This car snaps on me every lap. It feels like it was built for someone else's hands, not mine." The reply was rehearsed, dipped in political courtesy but devoid of reassurance: "Charles has adapted well. We believe this is the right direction." It was a dagger disguised as diplomacy, a confirmation that Hamilton's needs were secondary, that Ferrari's faith lay in Leclerc's trajectory. Every debrief became a battlefield, though no one dared call it that. Hamilton would sit across the table from Leclerc, his notes full of demands for stability, traction, predictability, while Charles pushed for sharper rotation, looser rear balance, and quicker turn-in. The engineers, subtly swayed, nodded more often to Charles. Meetings that once began with polite smiles ended with silence, so thick you could cut it with a blade. Hamilton began to feel like an intruder in his own team, a guest wearing borrowed colors, tolerated for his fame but never embraced as the soul of Ferrari. The politics inside Maranello were suffocating. Whispers leaked into the Italian press. Narratives spun about Hamilton's inability to adapt, about his supposed decline, about Ferrari's long-term commitment to Leclerc as their true leader. Each article stung like a calculated strike. Even as he stood on podiums, even when he dragged the car beyond its limits, the atmosphere was cold, distant. He had become a stranger inside the Temple of Red. For Hamilton, the breaking point wasn't a single moment but a collection of betrayals that layered themselves like scars. The setup meetings where his feedback was ignored, the strategy calls that favored Leclerc, the quiet but unmistakable signs that Ferrari's future was being written around the Monegasque. He had left Mercedes for a dream, but what he found in Ferrari was a theater of illusions, where the script had already been written and his role was secondary. Behind the scenes, Red Bull watched with predatory patience. Christian Horner and Helmut Marko, masters of timing, sensed the discontent bleeding out of Maranello. They whispered promises of machinery tailored to his strengths, of engineers who would sculpt a car around his precision, of a team willing to hand him the tools to fight not just for podiums, but for titles again. Hamilton, bruised by months of internal warfare, listened. The man who once vowed to end his career in red realized that loyalty meant nothing if it was not reciprocated. When he finally signed the contract, it was less an act of betrayal and more an act of liberation. He had tried to bend Ferrari to his vision, but Ferrari had chosen its path without him. The paddock erupted in disbelief, fans screamed of treachery, journalists scrambled to rewrite the sport's future, but for Hamilton, the move was clarity. He had freed himself from the prison of broken promises and stepped back into the arena armed with a team hungry for more glory. The echoes of his departure haunted Maranello. Engineers whispered about what might have been, fans split into factions, and Leclerc, for all his talent, felt the shadow of Hamilton's exit looming over his legacy. For Lewis, however, there was no regret. The fairy tale of Ferrari had crumbled into dust, and from its ruins, he had built something even more shocking. A future in the colors of Red Bull, a union no one believed possible, but one destined to shake Formula One to its very core. It was never simply about engines, wings, or data streams flashing across the screens. Beneath the surface of Ferrari's glittering facade, Hamilton was discovering something far more corrosive than mechanical imbalance. The suffocating chill of a hierarchy that seemed unwilling to grant him the stature he had carried across the world for over a decade. He had walked into Maranello with the aura of a 7-time world champion, expecting reverence, deference, at the very least acknowledgement of the empire he had built through sweat, precision, and relentless hunger. Instead, what he felt was indifference, as though his legacy were little more than a marketing tool, a shiny trophy displayed to appease the tifosi rather than the foundation of Ferrari's future. The realization gnawed at him, feeding a bitterness that grew stronger with every race weekend. His rapport with Leclerc, once carefully measured and respectful, eroded into something raw and jagged, stripped of pretense. At the beginning, there had been polite exchanges, handshakes that were firm but cautious, a recognition of one another's standing. That civility dissolved rapidly into sharp looks, muttered jabs, and open hostility. Each debrief turned into a verbal battlefield. What should have been technical discussions became personal skirmishes where datasheets and lap charts were weaponized as ammunition. Engineers sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes darting between the two drivers as though watching a storm build overhead, powerless to stop it. The powder keg truly ignited in Monaco. The narrow streets, the unforgiving walls, the weight of expectation. It was a pressure cooker that made tempers even more combustible. Hamilton's qualifying run was compromised, and the moment he returned to the garage, helmet ripped off, his anger erupted. He stormed into the cramped engineering room, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "You think you're untouchable here because they built this car around you," he snapped, his tone dripping with accusation, his words echoing off the walls crowded with telemetry screens. His glare was fixed on Leclerc, daring him to deny it. Charles, sitting upright, didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, his reply sharp, measured, but burning with defiance. "I don't need anyone to design anything for me. You're the one struggling, not me." That exchange reverberated far beyond the walls of the room. Whispers spread through the paddock, mechanics traded looks, journalists caught the scent of blood. But inside Ferrari, there was no attempt to mend the fracture. There was no hand of reconciliation, no mediator to cool the flames. Instead, the silence of leadership became fuel to Hamilton's growing resentment. Privately, in the company of those he trusted most, Hamilton vented with an intensity that revealed the depth of his frustration. His voice, usually measured and calm in private circles, cracked with disbelief and rage. "Fred has made his choice," he confessed bitterly. "He sees Charles as the future, and I'm just the ornament they paraded for the cameras, the figure to sell merchandise and wave at the crowd. There's no respect for the years I've given to this sport, no acknowledgement of what I've achieved, of who I am. To them, I'm just temporary." His words carried not only anger but the weight of betrayal, a man who had expected partnership but found himself sidelined in the very place he believed would honor his legacy. The tension reached a breaking point in one of Ferrari's most charged internal meetings. It was no longer just murmurs behind closed doors. Hamilton confronted Frédéric Vasseur directly, his composure shattered by months of accumulated disrespect. The room froze as Hamilton stood tall, voice thundering with the authority of a man who had conquered nearly every circuit on Earth. "I'm a 7-time champion, Fred. I didn't come here to play the role of some fading figure in the background. I came to Ferrari to build something historic, to leave a legacy, not to play second fiddle to a kid who hasn't proven himself on the same scale. You treat me like I'm an afterthought, like my presence here is decoration. That's not who I am, and you know it." His eyes bore into Vasseur's, the air trembling with the weight of his fury. But Vasseur's reply carried no warmth, no concession. It was as cold and clinical as the marble floors of Maranello itself. He didn't raise his voice, but the chill in his words was enough to pierce deeper than a scream. "Respect at Ferrari is not inherited, Lewis. It is not purchased by past glories. Titles don't grant immunity here. Every driver has to prove himself inside this team, regardless of what he's done elsewhere. Charles is part of our long-term vision, and you will have to accept that. This team does not revolve around you." The silence that followed was heavier than any roar of an engine. Hamilton's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, his entire body radiating the fury of a champion being stripped of the recognition he believed he had earned. The divide was now undeniable, unbridgeable. It wasn't merely a clash of personalities. It was a civil war brewing inside Ferrari, a struggle not just for track position but for identity, for control of the team's soul. The walls of Maranello, once imagined as a sanctuary for Hamilton's final masterpiece, had become the stage of a brutal confrontation where every word, every glance, every silence carved the rift deeper. That moment was the breaking point, the instant Hamilton understood with brutal clarity that no matter how much sweat, passion, and sacrifice he poured into the Ferrari project, no matter how much history and romance had drawn him there in the first place, the team's rigid structure would never bend itself around him. He had arrived in Maranello with a burning dream of carving out a legacy that mirrored, or perhaps even surpassed, the one forged by Schumacher, an image of standing triumphant in scarlet, immortalized as the man who brought Ferrari back to glory. But the dream had slowly twisted into a cage. What had once felt like destiny became suffocation. The red overalls, the adoring tifosi, the mythology. None of it was enough to hide the cracks, the politics, the unwillingness of Ferrari to give him the freedom he needed. Every debrief turned into a battle, every team meeting into a negotiation where his words were clipped and filtered. It was no longer about racing, it was about survival. Hamilton began to see the truth. He could not change Ferrari, and Ferrari would not change for him. That realization didn't come with fireworks or fanfare. It came in quiet moments, in lonely hotel rooms after brutal races, in hushed conversations with those he trusted most, in the suffocating stillness after another weekend of frustration. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man still hungry, still capable of rewriting history, yet trapped in an environment that would never let him breathe. And so, away from the flashbulbs, away from the reporters who speculated endlessly about his loyalty to Ferrari, he began to entertain possibilities he had once sworn he wouldn't consider. The whispers started with casual phone calls, then moved into carefully arranged meetings behind tinted glass doors, in neutral hotel suites, and inside the less conspicuous corners of paddock hospitality units. There was a coded language to it, nothing ever written down, everything spoken in measured tones. The most surprising approach came not from Mercedes, the team where Hamilton had made himself a legend, but from the very rival who had defined so much of his recent career, Red Bull Racing. Red Bull, fresh off internal turmoil that had shaken its foundation, suddenly found itself at a crossroads. Christian Horner, the figure who had stood at the helm for nearly 2 decades, had resigned amid a cloud of controversy that rippled through the paddock. His departure did not merely leave a leadership vacuum, it restructured the team's financial priorities and loosened long-standing restrictions. For years, Red Bull had built their empire around Verstappen, carefully avoiding the temptation of pairing him with another megastar. Their philosophy had been simple: do not upset the ecosystem that guaranteed championships. But now, with budget space opened, leadership dynamics shifting, and a renewed determination to prove their dynasty wasn't fragile, Red Bull decided on an audacious gamble. They would chase Hamilton. It sounded insane on paper, Verstappen and Hamilton, bitter rivals, forced into the same garage. Yet for Red Bull, that insanity was precisely the allure. If they could tame the chaos, if they could align the two most dominant forces of modern Formula One, they wouldn't just remain on top, they would rewrite history. It wasn't about Verstappen alone anymore, it was about creating a legacy untouchable by any competitor. And Hamilton, disillusioned at Ferrari, was suddenly open to conversations he would have once dismissed outright. The first serious discussion happened far from prying eyes. A rain delay in Montreal provided the perfect cover. While the track crews worked frantically to clear the drenched circuit, a handful of men slipped quietly into a dimly lit hospitality suite tucked at the back of the paddock. There were no cameras, no journalists, just the faint sound of rain hammering against the canvas roof. At the center of the room sat Helmut Marko, the grizzled strategist who had seen everything in Formula One, leaning forward across the table with the intensity of a man who knew time was precious. He didn't waste words. His voice was gravelly but steady as he looked Hamilton directly in the eye. "You don't belong in a place where they silence you," Marko said, cutting straight through the fog of politics and frustration that had surrounded Hamilton in recent months. "At Ferrari, they clip your wings. Here we don't do that. At Red Bull, you'll have freedom, equal footing, and you'll have a car capable of winning from the very first lap you drive it. You and Max together, it's something no one can stop. Hamilton listened, his face unreadable, his body language deliberately guarded. He sat back in his chair, slowly sipping a cup of black coffee, the steam curling into the air as if it carried his hesitation. For years, he had been painted as Verstappen's great adversary, the man who stood in the way of Red Bull's golden era. The thought of sitting in their car, wearing their colors, felt surreal. But there was also a spark flickering inside him again, a spark he thought Ferrari had extinguished. He placed the cup down gently, the smallest of smiles tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And when it really matters," Hamilton asked quietly, his voice laced with both suspicion and curiosity, "when it comes down to the wire, will I always be second to Max? Or is this just another cage with a different paint job?" Marco didn't hesitate. His reply was blunt, almost harsh, but it was exactly what Hamilton needed to hear. "Not if you're faster. At Red Bull, speed speaks louder than politics. Beat him on track, and the team will follow. We don't protect egos here, we protect results." The words lingered in the air, heavy and intoxicating. For Hamilton, it was the first time in months, maybe years, that he felt the promise of freedom, of a team that would unleash him rather than restrain him. He didn't commit, not then, not with so much at stake, but as the rain continued to fall outside, Hamilton knew something had shifted inside him. The romantic dream of Ferrari was gone. A new possibility, dangerous, volatile, but irresistible, had just opened its door. Weeks dragged into months, and the negotiations that began as whispers in backrooms transformed into a full-scale tug-of-war, a clash of ambition, legacy, and raw leverage. Red Bull's top brass, sensing the chance to pull off what many considered impossible, sharpened their strategy like hunters circling their prey. It was no longer about money alone, though the figures being discussed shattered every ceiling Formula One had ever known. It was about reshaping the power dynamics of the sport itself. The departure of Christian Horner had left a void, not just at the head of the team but in the culture of the garage, and the Austrian outfit knew it. They didn't just want Lewis Hamilton the driver, they wanted Lewis Hamilton the institution. For the first time in his career, Hamilton wasn't merely offered a contract, he was handed influence, a voice that could ripple through every corner of the team. Alongside the eye-watering salary and record-breaking performance incentives came the promise that he could bring trusted allies into the fold. Engineers who had been with him in the trenches, strategists who knew how to extract victory out of chaos, confidants who had shared the long nights and bitter disappointments of previous battles. Red Bull didn't pitch him a safe seat. They offered him a throne at the table, a chance to carve the team's future in his own image. His deal contained layers far beyond podium bonuses. It included mentorship responsibilities, a vision for cultivating the next wave of Red Bull talent, and an open invitation to shape the team not just for today but for the seasons to come. When the ink dried, Hamilton gathered only a handful of his inner circle, those he trusted with his most guarded truths. In a quiet, almost reverent tone, stripped of his usual theatrical defiance, he told them, "This is it. Ferrari wanted a statue, a figure to parade around their museum. Red Bull wants a weapon. They see me as firepower, not furniture. I'll prove to them, and to the world, that I am far from finished." His words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. The conviction in his voice was enough to send a chill through the room. The news didn't leak, it detonated. Ferrari had no time to build a narrative, no chance to craft the spin. The moment the first headline hit, chaos erupted through Maranello's corridors. Journalists swarmed outside the iconic red gates, demanding answers, their cameras flashing like thunder in a storm. Inside the factory, mechanics whispered among themselves, stunned but not entirely surprised. For months, Hamilton's body language had carried disillusionment, now it had crystallized into betrayal. Charles Leclerc, when approached by a trusted mechanic, reportedly smirked with equal parts relief and disdain. "If he never believed in us, then good riddance. We don't need someone who complains more than he drives," he snapped, his frustration thinly veiled as indifference. His words traveled quickly, feeding the narrative that the team's golden child had never fully accepted Hamilton into the heart of Ferrari. Fred Vasseur, blindsided and broken by the news, summoned Hamilton for one final conversation. His voice trembled, weighed down by a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. "So this is how you repay Ferrari?" he asked, eyes searching for remorse that wasn't there. Hamilton, calm yet ice-cold, delivered his reply like a blade slicing clean. "I repaid Ferrari by saving face when your politics tore it apart. I held my tongue longer than I should have. I carried myself with respect while others played games. I'm not here to be second best, Fred. I never have been. I'm here to win. And you made it clear that under your leadership, that was never going to happen. There was no yelling, no theatrics. Just the quiet ruthlessness of a man cutting ties and moving on without looking back. When the announcement went public, the world erupted in a frenzy rarely seen in the sport. Social media imploded, fans tearing themselves into factions within minutes. Some hailed Hamilton's audacity, praising him for daring to walk into the lion's den alongside Verstappen, calling it the boldest move in modern F1 history. Others condemned it as reckless, warning that Red Bull's garage would implode under the weight of two egos too massive to coexist. Analysts filled entire broadcasts with speculation, questioning strategy meetings, car development, even sponsorship stability. Headlines screamed of a super team and a civil war, while fans argued late into the night about whether history was about to be rewritten or destroyed. Behind closed doors in Milton Keynes, the real storm began. Hamilton and Verstappen came face to face for the first time since the ink had dried. There were no cameras, no microphones, just two gladiators sizing each other up in the quiet hum of the factory. The tension was palpable, the kind of silence that carried more meaning than 1,000 words. Verstappen extended his hand, firm, unwavering, his voice steady but laced with warning. "Welcome to the fight, Lewis. Just remember, this is my house." Hamilton grasped his hand tightly, refusing to let go first, his grin wide but sharpened by challenge. Every house can hold two kings, Max. The question is, who reigns longer? The handshake lingered, neither willing to surrender an inch, the unspoken declaration of war echoing louder than any press release ever could. Battle lines had been carved into the tarmac long before the lights went out on the next season. The paddock buzzed with an energy that bordered on hysteria, everyone sensing they were on the cusp of witnessing something seismic. This wasn't just another rivalry, this was the collision of two eras, two philosophies, two titans unwilling to bend. The garages of Red Bull would become both palace and battlefield, every race a skirmish in a larger war for supremacy. Meanwhile, Ferrari sat wounded, their dream crumbling, their carefully built image shattered in front of millions. They had gambled on Hamilton as a savior, a legend draped in red to restore their glory. Instead, they had been left abandoned, their unity fractured, their future uncertain. And as Hamilton marched into enemy territory with a fire in his eyes and history on his mind, it became clear to everyone, this wasn't just a move. This was a declaration. A legend was about to write his final chapters not in red, but in the colors of the very team that once stood as his fiercest rival. The stage was set for one of the most explosive rivalries Formula One had ever dared to imagine, and the world was salivating for the first spark to ignite.